Okay, I'm recording. It's Tuesday morning at 7:42 a.m. How are you doing, Patrick?
I'm okay. Clearly ready.
I had
The day is young and old.
yesterday we were talking about we're talking about at dinner about repressed homosexual feelings and whether we're all bisexual deep down. And I joked that I said I wish I was bisexual and I wish I was vegetarian because philosophically I'm both, but like my appetite disagrees with me. And we talked about ancient Romans, you know, being the all the 11 of the 12 Roman emperors slept with both men and women. And then by odd coincidence, a friend sent me something yesterday, like linking like police brutality to some like repressed, like some Freud. It made some image of like Freud and police brutality and he said something about how Hitler was a repressed homosexual, and I was like, what an odd thing to say in 2020. Like, we don't think in these Freudian terms very much, but it somehow infused my dreams, and I dreamt that this. I'm a very affectionate person. I don't have any fear of homosexuality whatsoever, and in my dreams, like I was in Italy, and this guy was being like too touchy-feely with me, and it made me uncomfortable, and I got very violent with him, and I took him up against the wall, and I like was threatening him to like smash his face in or something. I'm something that's just thoughts that I never have in any way, shape, or form. And I woke up then thinking about Bernardo Bertollucci, who was a dear friend and mentor to me, and then he did like 30 years of Freudian analysis. And he made The Conformist, which I think is one of the greatest color cinematography. I think maybe the greatest color cinematography ever in any film. And so I woke up and was watching a little bit of like images from The Conformist and interviews with Bernardo Bertollucci. And you know, he had this kind of now seemingly very dated view, but interesting nonetheless, that, you know, the conformist, he's a fascist because he's a repressed homosexual. And it was just like, I just went down this like weird 1970s Freudian analysis, repressed sexuality, entering from my conversations yesterday into my dreams and then into my love of cinema and admiration for Bertolucci.
Did you see The Staircase, the documentary series?
No.
About the guy who was charged with murder for his wife ending up at the bottom of the staircase? No?
Oh, we talked about this at the pool once?
Maybe Michael Peterson. I think that's his name. Anyway, it came out in the course of the trial that he had an affair with a man 10 years prior.
Uh-huh.
And, I mean, completely irrelevant to the case. Completely irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
But that it was admissible in part because of the South.
Right.
And but because like it was arguing a certain deviousness to his character. It's a really like kind of like fascinating social cultural moment in the documentary series, in part because it's like, okay, you have a jury. What is relevant? What, like, of all the things a person does, what is relevant to their character? If he had a heterosexual affair 10 years prior,
nobody would talk about it.
Would it have come up in court? No, not at all. What would that have to do?
Maybe 50 years ago, just having an affair would be enough to
back then, yeah, sure.
Establish deviousness.
This was 20 years ago.
Now
15
the bar
years ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just this implicit like amorality or immorality about his actions, and I think it was because it was a homosexual act.
And anyway, this is just random spewings from my half-awake subconscious. Do with it what you will, dear listener. I don't know what to make of it. I still haven't processed it. Literally, like, just was opening my eyes. I watched Bertolucci being interviewed by Charlie Rose in 1994, having just come out with probably his worst movie, the Little Buddha. But I had the privilege of spending one day each summer with him of the last like maybe 7 or 8 years before he died. I would go visit him in Todi, about an hour from our place in Rome, outside of Rome, and he was in a wheelchair, and he was just one of the most interesting people I've ever met, because I mean, his head was just so his brain was just so amazing. Like he was one of the people, we've talked about eloquence and the ability to surprise one with words and always take the conversation to a place of deep and surprising insight, no matter what it is that you're talking about. And I've always just admired that skill so much. And you know, he was a poet first, and then he didn't want to be a poet because his father was a poet, and he discovered cinema when he was about 20 or 16. I think he got his first camera, and then he made his first feature when he was 21. And when he was 20, he'd gotten to work for Pasolini as an assistant. And anyway, just such a brilliant mind. When he died a couple of years ago, they put his body to lay in state at the Campidoglio, the city hall of Rome, designed by Michelangelo, and in the center was the dead body of Bernardo Bertollucci, and his hands were swollen with like death, and they looked huge. And I wasn't there, but my cousin sent me a photograph, and people just got to visit this dead body of this great master and, you know, icon of Italian cinema history.
Did you record the conversations?
I didn't record any of the conversations, unfortunately, with him. I don't know if I even... No, I was always just wanting to be respectful and not too starstruck. And
what would you do? Like, how do you confront like that kind of genius or someone you respect so much? When you spend time with them, what do you...
You know,
do you just ask? Do you just hang out?
Yeah, hang out and ask. And you know, I think that always what the great... I've had privilege of knowing and getting to know some, you know, amazing... Genius also seems a bit old-fashioned, right? Like we don't think in those terms so much anymore. But I think there's something to be said, obviously, for people who have done great things. And what I've noticed that they have in common, because I got to work for like Bertolucci's cinematographer, Vittorio Storaro, who won 3 Academy Awards, and Francis Ford Coppola's production designer, also did all the Godfather films and everything. And I was always looking for a through line with these people: Coppola, Oliver Stone, Storaro, Bertolucci, Antonioni I got to hang out with. And there was always a kind of freshness with which they looked at the world, that they never rested on their laurels. Like there was always a sense that, and there's oftentimes in the hierarchy of cinema is so, you know, deeply hierarchical. It's one of the last remaining true pure dictatorships, Coppola said once. And in the hierarchy, there's often a second in command. So the production designer has his art director. And I would notice, I was like 20 working on the sets of these films, and the art director was always more arrogant, more, you know, I'm the art director on, you know, working for Warren Beatty or Francis Ford Coppola. And you could see a certain smugness and I know it all about them. Whereas the one in charge always was looking at the world as if it was new and full of opportunity and didn't know everything yet. And I thought that that's what separates the people at the very, very top from just one level beneath that. You know, you have to kind of have this humility and openness to the unique situation.
And do you think that's personnel management? Like they're effectively, to be in command, you have to kind of be at least perceived to be open to ideas. Otherwise you get none from those below you.
No. I think there's a genuine. I think that there's a genuine. It's going back to the Heidegger being in the world thing, like responsiveness to the unique situation rather than to the general situation. So that I think that the second in command was good always at like being. You can rest on your laurels at a certain point because you have seen it all. You've done so many things, and so you can have this kind of posture of like being a senior official, of having this incredible experience and seniority, and that will allow you to get almost to the top because you actually have had all that experience, and you deserve to be smug and arrogant. There's no one's going to tell you can't. You know, if you've won Academy Awards and, you know, worked on these incredible films, but to get from that to being the actual genius requires never being complacent, never thinking you know it, and really being open to responding to what's actually happening that you haven't seen before. And that's what I think separates the top from the tip top. And I would notice that with Bertolucci, he was just attentive and really listening, and then really making an interesting comment about what you had to say, because he wasn't just saying something he'd said before. He was saying something fresh and new. And when I got to work with Oliver Stone, it was the same thing. Like every person who would come up with him with an issue, he was like, never like, oh, that's not my job. Like, how can a PA come to me about like what kind of like stapler is going to be on the table. No, that's important. He understood that everything came down to him, and everything was important, and everybody who came to talk to him got his undivided attention, and it's just remarkable. I mean, it gives me chills just thinking about it. Like just that degree of presence and of anyway.
So why film alone is the last bastion of hierarchy and dictatorship? I mean, why not also like medicine? I'm thinking about my scientific career and then my journalist career. There's 2 times. This is a weird, vulnerable story. There's 2 times in my life I recall. So my PhD lab, my PhD advisor was a primatologist, right? So we did a lot of like primate behavior and primate social behavior. And it was twice. Once I was walking down a hallway and I surprisingly ran into this neuroscientist will remain unnamed, who was top of the field. And I was like coming out of the gym and he was coming in and in a hallway. So we do this thing with mice where if you take a paper towel tube and put 2 mice on either end, they'll run and they'll meet in the middle. And then the dominant male will keep going forward and the less dominant male will like scurry backwards. And it's just like, you can do this like in a cage with 5 mice. There's a ranking. And like if 2 and 3 meet, 3 will back up. If 2 and 4 meet, 4 will back up. If 1 and 2 meet, 2 will back up. And in the primate world, you also like break eye contact. And I noticed twice in my life. Once, head of a major New York magazine. Second, neuroscientist who's guaranteed if you wrote the Nobel Committee a letter every morning, like threatening their family and children, he would still win the Nobel Prize. And both of these times in a split second, like hundreds of milliseconds, my eyes, I think because I was so surprised, I actually did a thing where I averted eye contact. And I because I'm in a primatology lab, I'm like, what the fuck am I doing? Am I really deferring? Is that what this is? Is this a hierarchy? I'm like taller, younger, like more strapping, like there's many features in which I win, but there's also implicit hierarchy to these careers, right? Where these people are just badass all-stars. And I deferred, like with my eyes. And so I have a lot of friends who are doctors who say there's nothing more hierarchically rigid than the medical field, because every single year you're effectively a quantified like category of improved. Like every year you're year 1 med school, year 2 med school, and then you're a resident, and then you're a thing. And it's like, it's extremely hierarchical and it's extremely dictatorial.
So I think I would love to just spend this entire hour talking about hierarchy. I think we've backed into it by accident.
I was hinting at that.
No, but it's an incredible topic because it comes from, you have this basic primordial way that it manifests in these mice. And then obviously you have this high end, creative considerations. And then you have this political considerations. Obviously, I think of the right as being, embracing hierarchy. And I think of the left as trying to question hierarchy. And of course, like, so Dali, for example, was very reactionary, right? Unapologetically right wing, very unusual for an artist, right? You think of artists as trying to question, reorder, always. But Dali said, no, everything is hierarchy, and like, don't be afraid of attaining, of seeking perfection. You're never going to get it, so you might as well try, And he was so into like, the discipline of like, perfect technique, and so you think of that as kind of a hierarchical pursuit. But then also it's why people, I think, are rightly a little bit dismissive of Dali's art. Like, it seems a little facile. It's impressive on a kind of technical level, but like people who are really into like, people who are serious in the art world think of him as a kind of, easy for the common man to appreciate, but like not really that deep. It has this kind of, I think, and maybe now I'm thinking, having this thought as we speak, so I don't know if I can iterate it well, but like what I was saying earlier about the second in command, they're the ones who were embracing the hierarchy. They were proud of themselves for being in the hierarchy and wanted to reinforce it and show the production assistants that they are better. Whereas I never got that feeling working for Storaro or Tavoularis or these people. Yes, they had power, but they also had this, approachability. Like I never got a sense from Bertollucci that like I'm better than you. Don't talk to me like.
Well, that's part of the skill and mastery, I think, right? So like the effortless aesthetic of high skill or high command is to make it look effortless, right? Like the absolute most elegant ballerina or the best of the best when you look at like soccer players, like Lionel Messi, kind of like they just go through the field. They somehow just have the ball and they just move through even other professionals. And I think the difference between like perhaps even in command, which I think is in aesthetic art the same way as all kinds of other like skill-based displays, if it looks effortless at the top, right? When you're the best of the best, when you're at the absolute top.
But in some sense that was dependent on the hierarchy underneath, and not acknowledge
absolutely.
that.
Well, like Lionel Messi doesn't look like he's gliding through water, even though these are professional soccer players trying to stop him, unless there's those professional soccer players around him, which in some sense elevate his performance by virtue of their existence and by virtue of them being there and being less good and being less elegant in some way. So command, I'm sure, works kind of similarly, where if you're concerned with hierarchy, you can never be at the top, right? Like if you're obviously performing and arrogant in that way that the PA was, or the kind of
the
2 through 10 are, you know, because they embrace it because they're so close to the top. But the top of the top, it's effortless. You have to make the appearance of great effortless.
So my great grandfather was this, you know, one very old fashioned prince. He never kind of entered even the 20th century, even though he was born in the 1860s, I think, died in the 1950s. But I would always hear these stories about him because he was so dependent on his butler / manservant that he couldn't do anything without him. He couldn't get dressed. He couldn't eat. He couldn't, like, he was his chauffeur. He was like dress him. It was a little like Bertie and Jeeves, for those of you who have read Woodhouse. If you haven't, you should. And the butler, in a way, embraced the hierarchy even more than the prince. And the story that my father would tell to kind of reinforce this was that there was like communists marching in the streets of the town of Vignanello, where the Ruspoli Castle is. And my great grandfather and his butler was looking out through the window, and one of the placards that they were holding up was protesting the fact that the lower person had to speak to the person they were working for with les, which is the formal, like vous in French.
Yeah.
And then the other way around, they were saying tu, right? And they were saying everybody should say tu to everybody. We shouldn't have this kind of hierarchy of language like this.
Yeah.
And so my great-grandfather turned to his butler and says, with horror, said, "Are you going to start saying tu to me," right? Which is the informal you. And the butler said, "No, because any pleasure that I could possibly attain from saying tu to you would be completely obliterated by having to hear the assistant butler say tu to me."
so that's great. Do you know about this thing, displacement aggression?
No.
The phrase. So I'm trying to get at the difference between like I'm 90% using facts and 10% using theory I just made up on the spot.
Okay. Noted.
Just this interesting idea that maybe hierarchy for those not at the very, very top is a bit more at issue for them, right?
Consequential in a way.
And so displacement aggression is, in primate world, if you're number one and you go and slap around number two, it can't take it out on you. Can't take it out on number one, just physically, emotionally, socially. So they go to number 5 and slap number 5 around, and number 5 goes and slaps number 9 around. And it's this downhill displacement aggression where without an outlet, if you can't attack back, you can't reciprocate against the target that attacked you. And so one way to think about this is number 2 through infinity, 2 through n, they can displace their aggression. And it's called displacement aggression as you go downhill. Number 1 is just called aggression. It's not displacement aggression, right? You have free reign to aggress or aggrieve anyone, right? But everyone else has to deal, and by virtue of them having to notice. So if you're number 4, you have to know the difference between 3 through 1 and 5 through n, right? And so you have to be attuned to the hierarchy and attuned to the levels to know who you can go pick on. Whereas if you're 1, you don't have to think about it because you can pick on anyone. And I remember once in in San Francisco, getting off. I was doing research early in my career at UCSF at some hospital, and they had this Muni. Muni is the most like aggravating thing in the goddamn world. It's just San Francisco infrastructure. It's just barbaric. And oh, come on, it's not barbaric, but it's slow. It's annoying. So anyway, Muni's frustrating. And this woman, wearing nurse scrubs, comes out of the hospital straight onto the Muni, right? And she, the driver of the Muni, kind of accelerates somewhat quickly while she's still standing, and she just proceeds for the next few minutes to berate him through the window while he's driving all of us, right? She just stands there and yells at him and berates him and says, "I can't believe you did that. That's really dangerous. I can't believe you did that." Maybe there's some reason. Maybe she just had to deal with a patient who that exact same thing happened to and broke her hip and died. I don't know. But she then, as this guy's still driving us, all of us, it's fucking rush hour in San Francisco. Nobody's having a good time, right? She takes her phone out and calls the number that says, if you have a complaint, here's the driver ID. And so while into his like right ear, as he's driving us, she starts on the phone saying, I have a complaint about driver XYZ, ID number X. He did this and that and this. And I called the same number within earshot of her so she could listen to me. Uh-huh. And I said, I just want you to know that this woman it's called displacement aggression. She clearly had a bad day and she's now trying to pick on the Muni driver. So whatever she complained about, you should completely ignore. And like, amazing. It was clearly, she was stressed to all high hell. She came out of, being effectively, nurse is not the top of the hierarchy in a hospital. Mm-hmm. And it just seemed so clear to me that she was just displacing her aggression onto this poor Muni driver.
And the person at the top maybe you're saying is so dependent on all the aggression going on underneath and so able to do whatever they want that they don't need to reinforce their hierarchy. They don't need to reinforce the concept of hierarchy because their entire being is just only aided by it.
Yes, it can be invisible to them so as to appear to be effortless, so as to appear that they're not worried about it. But It's because of the kind of platter of options available to them to be to pick on effectively. So I guess I just only want to argue that there are dictatorships everywhere, all around the world if you look closely.
Yeah. No, it definitely makes me so I think my disposition is to question hierarchy, and I do think that obviously there's the hierarchy, and then there is the way the hierarchy happens to be structured. So you could agree with the concept of hierarchy and disagree with the way it's spread around, right? So now when we question the power that the police has, you can believe there should be hierarchy in the hospital and on a movie set and disagree with the fact that these, small-minded, sadistic, criminal, petty minds get to have all this power over other people somewhat arbitrarily, right? So I'm wondering if you can embrace the places where hierarchy. I'm wondering if you can keep a kind of anarchic mentality by questioning and rebelling against the existing hierarchies while still embracing some form of abstract hierarchy in ways that it is actually beautiful or helpful to like artistic creation, let's say, for example, or saving people in a hospital room or something like that. Or is the progressive anarchic left-wing view committed to questioning hierarchy itself? Like that. What is our goal as revolutionaries, in whatever sense we want to be revolutionaries, in the sense that we want change and progress? How much are we committed to the idea of doing away with hierarchy versus how much are we committed to doing away with the hierarchy as it is, as it stands, right?
Right.
So on that note, then my second little YouTube morning meandering was an interview with Bertrand Russell from 1952, and it just popped up on after the Bertollucci interview as something suggested to watch. And Bertrand Russell was the kind of reason I got into philosophy. I read him in high school, Why I'm Not a Christian and History of Western Philosophy, and I was just so taken by his intelligence and his passion, and he was an early anti-hierarchicalist, advocating for free love already in the 1910s and 20s, and and he was born in 1872. And you watch this interview on YouTube. He's just a filmed interviewed. What's that?
No, nothing.
And he talks about his grandfather. His parents died when he was an infant, and his grandfather, Charlie Rose, is interviewing him. And no, wait, sorry, Rose was interviewing Bertollucci. Sorry, my brain is still waking up. The interviewer asks Bertrand Russell, like, what can you tell us about your grandfather who raised you? And he's like, well, he was born during the French Revolution, and he was in Parliament.
Napoleonic general.
Yes, he was in Parliament during Napoleon. And here's a guy you're just watching a movie like of an interview with. And you were talking the other day about our inability to understand temporal,
Yeah, the temporal horizon of the past appears much more compressed and kind of quicker than if you imagine the same amount in duration of years into the future.
Oh, you think it's different from the past and the future, huh?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. If you think about like 1820, and you ask like, okay, draw on a line how far back, arbitrary units, like on a piece of paper, here, the middle of the paper is the present. Draw on a line backwards how far back you think 1820 is. They put a thing. And then how far into the future does 2220 feel? Mm-hmm. It feels much farther into the future than, respectively, 1820 feels into the past, even though.
And why is that?
I don't know.
You just like observed this.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Anyway, Bertrand Russell, I just want to stay on him a little bit because he was just such a wonderful, brilliant mind. And again, we can then go back to like thoughts on hierarchy. But he was, as a young, brilliant mind, he was looking for some certainty in the world, and so he thought maybe it would be found in mathematics. And so he spent 10 years with Alfred North Whitehead, like trying to find the origins of mathematics in logic. It takes, I think, up to page 350 of the Principia Mathematica to even define the number 1. And so he thought that he could find some truth there. And then in another interview I saw with him when he was like 98, he was looking back on his career, and he said, I was very intelligent in my 20s. My brain worked really well. And so I was doing mathematical work. But then as you age, your brain deteriorates a little bit. And he said by the time I was 30, my brain didn't work well enough to do mathematics anymore. I became too dumb for mathematics. So I got into philosophy. And then he said, he was looking to find some truth also because he thought maybe he could find some basis in like religion and ethics, and he found the opposite. He said he found that it questioned all of those things, and that's what bothered everybody about doing philosophy, and what a like essentially rebellious act it was to question all of our mores. But what was interesting is that it led him to what I think of as more ethical views. Like he was a pacifist during World War I when everybody else was gung-ho about war, and he was advocating for free love because he thought that the strictures of the church with sexuality were wrong. So it was a moral view, but it was a moral view based on like looking at things with a questioning eye and questioning the authority of the church when it wasn't founded in anything rational or true, right?
Yeah.
And then he said, I became too dumb for philosophy. Once I got to age 70, my brain deteriorated even more, and I got into politics. And then he was like marching against the war and against the nuclear bomb and everything. And I remember telling this story to my brother's mother-in-law. She was in one of the Ferragamo family, and they're this big family, one of the only family that still owns the these big fashion brands that are now mostly owned by conglomerates. And we were meeting the Ferragamo family for the first time because my brother was marrying into the family, my older brother. And I happened to tell this story of Bertrand Russell. I don't know why it came up. And without missing a beat, Mrs. Ferragamo turned to me after I said that he became too dumb for philosophy and got into politics. And she said, let me guess, after that fashion? And it was this wonderful self-deprecating reaction. But anyway, I'm very, very interested in what should our relationship to hierarchy and thereby authority be? Because I'm deeply suspicious of power. I think that's what makes somebody radical or progressive or.
I noticed your phrase "married into a family."
Yeah.
And I was trying to think if whoever, or whenever, or if ever, I get married, like how odd it would be if they described like getting married into my family, which they wouldn't do, which is a hierarchical term that I think means like it's a successful family.
Right. Yeah,
Like,
for sure.
but that's a very weird thing that we have a phrase, we have a category of ways of describing just a verb, married into, like
yeah.
that. Clearly, it's like families at the time. It's hierarchical families, right?
Very
So
much
even our language is reflecting this.
Yeah.
No one would say I married into the House family.
They're very
Like, oh, what'd you get?
down
Great.
to the House family.
Great, you get to split my student loan debt. Now we own half. Now we own half each.
Yeah. So, no, and then now it's occurring to me like maybe this kind of like disdain that is had by, it's ironic, right? That the left is seen now as this kind of elitist group. And often in the middle of America, the red states, they think of people who are liberal as being, and so it occurs to me that there might be a sense that by what, it used to be that the left was a working class, like you would have unions and workers joining the left, and now a lot of those people have become right wing, right? You have a lot of people in the middle of America who would traditionally have, and they see the concerns of the contemporary left as being elitist and not really in touch with their concerns, right?
Sure.
And I'm wondering if they think of our questioning of the hierarchies that whether it's police, whether it's racial injustice, whether it's incarceration, all of these things that we question, they might see it as only possible against the background of a hierarchy in which they are the underlings. You know what I'm saying? Like that's why there's this kind of like this sense of elitism amongst people who are ostensibly questioning hierarchy.
Well, there's also like, what do you believe are the borders of your tribe? Do you believe it's the small town? Do you believe it's the family unit? Do you believe it's the small town you live in? Do you believe it's the city? Do you believe it's the state, hence states' rights? Do you believe it's the country, hence xenophobia? Do you believe it's the whole planet? And hence, like, you're Gaia if you do. Like it's about kind of, in some sense, the hierarchy as it's defined by the borders of the tribe, as it's defined by what you count as your in-group versus out-group. And I think a lot of like political persuasions might just be based on some genetic switch about how many people you expect to be in your troop. And if it's just approximately the size of a state, you're gung-ho states' rights. If it's approximately the size of a country, you're like, that's our border. It's us versus them. It's U.S. versus everyone else. But if you're just a little bit more holistic, your hierarchy can, contain the whole globe.
And then it becomes also beyond humans, and you get into animal rights and like, and why should we kill animals for our
right? Is the human at the top of the evolutionary biological consciousness hierarchy?
So
and some people think yes, and some people think it's a steep drop off between human and everything else, and some people think it's a slow graded slope. And based on just that internal impression, the way you visualize the concept of the category of the hierarchy, like leads to the moral choices we make about which do we eat, which do we slaughter. Pigs are hierarchically more important for Jewish cultures. Cows are hierarchically more important than other animals for Indian cultures, or Muslim cultures. And, cats, in ancient Egypt, you had to save. If a cat was in danger, it was illegal not to try to save that cat from a burning building. And so you just have these implicit hierarchies everywhere that are shaping the behavior.
But as we grow the sense of the in-group, there is a sense where you start to say, okay, well then we need to abolish there does seem to be a sense of the abolition of the hierarchies as you get bigger and bigger. So if you say all of humanity, and again it's this kind of cliche like new hippie idea, like we're all citizens of the world, and we have to take care of our shared planet, and we have to share it with the animals and with each other, and have a peace. And that seems that as you get higher and higher, it does seem like you are abolishing the hierarchy, right?
Yeah, at some point it becomes definitionally impossible if you have like a homogenous, if you don't have these in-group, out-group things. I mean, I think it's interesting. People have talked a lot about like this generation is probably going to encode a lot of the values for AI systems, artificial intelligence systems. And the question is like, are we ready as a world to, is this the moment in time at the moral snapshot that we really want to take, where AI become like early 21st century people on this planet? Because like, we still have the untouchables in India. It's like a vast percentage of the people on this planet are existing at the like socially castigated down at the very bottom, where everything is different. It's appalling. It's absolutely appalling that like we still have this present day on a planet as it exists right now. And so like I don't even think we're close to ready to freeze frame and snapshot our kind of moral codes.
Yeah. And then you get to the point also where if you know, it can become an embracing of like, once you do away with all of these borders, then you start to embrace a kind of globalism, and that globalism can have these accidental kind of new power structures that come up, whether they're corporate and so then there can be a resistance to that, which turns into a localism again.
Right.
And then you have this meeting of left and right, where at the extremes, they kind of go to the same place. And then, so that we were talking yesterday in the hot tub before you came back about Heidegger's
do stuff without me.
He left. It's his fault. But we were talking about Heidegger's Nazism, right? And this is very problematic for anybody who is interested in his thought. You know, tempered somewhat by the fact that everybody who took up Heidegger, afterwards as the basis of their philosophy, were a lot of very progressive left-wing thinkers, whether it's Foucault or Deleuze or Bert Dreyfus, who was a Jewish left-wing intellectual. Like, he didn't seem to have a problem with Heidegger's horrible politics, right?
Yeah.
But then you look inside the philosophy and you say, is it in there? Because that would be
right.
really problematic, right? And I think it's in there in the sense of like this wanting to embrace the local, right? Of like wanting to, like, he wanted to like resist globalization affecting German identity, right? And you can see that being both a left-wing and a right-wing concern, and with a different flavor, obviously, right? But the idea of like not allowing some global power to destroy the meaningful differences between people, between cultures and everything. Yeah. So at what point does that become violent and, horrific in the sense of like, okay, destroying the other? And at what point does embracing differences celebrate those differences? And what is it, the different philosophical underpinning between those two worldviews that are so, they can meet in this uncomfortable place? But one is fascist and reactionary, and one is, progressive. And then of course there's the other extreme, which is a kind of dictatorial left, right?
There's this robotics competition in Germany called RoboCup. That's held every year. It's little robots that are playing soccer.
Okay.
And they're terrible at it, right? Or historically they've been terrible at it. They're like moving and kicking a ball is like a very difficult task, harder than self-driving cars. And so for a while each team was controlled by a central computer, which kind of like, moved and strategized with each as if it's like an appendage on a single unified control system. And then they switched at some point to decentralized, which means each of the robots is independently controlled. Mm-hmm. They have eyes, they have cameras, looking out, and what that means is that when they start the game, one of the interesting things they have to do is determine which team they're on. It's not pre-programmed which team they're on. And so they use these things are like kind of coffee cup sized little robots that run around and kick like a little ping pong. So how do you determine which team you're on? They use their eyes to look at jersey color. So they're literally using like skin color to say us versus them. And then if they have to build in rules about who's on your team and who's not on your team. So they end up having like, okay, I have the same color skin as that other robot. I'm going to treat that robot differently than I'm going to treat this other colored skin robot. And if it's the opponent, they'll sometimes tackle the opponent if it's useful. But if it's on the same team, because you're playing a team sport, you'll back off and you'll cooperate. And so like it's such an innocent little thing. It's such an innocent little sporting event. But what these programmers did and these roboticists did is they effectively built in the worst of humanity quickly into these little robots, right? Like visually skin colored based us versus them. You're on my team, I won't hurt you. You're not on my team, I'm going to hurt you.
Well, sports are inherently fascistic, maybe. It's all about uniforms and us versus them and hierarchy and all of the things that we're questioning right now.
Well, and so there was this old study, like 50s or 60s, I believe, that was looking at teenage boys as they came to camp, and then they arbitrarily assigned them two groups, and they just had them compete, like come to camp for a week, and we're going to do a lot of kind of like, team-based, randomly assigned. So these kids just didn't, it didn't matter which team they're on, but as soon as they made the teams, it got so violent and nasty that they had to cancel the experiment because of how hostile both sides were being to each other. These arbitrarily chosen in-groups and out-groups. And what they ended up doing, which was not part of the experimental protocol at first, but they ended up wanting to like figure out like how do you undo this? Like, look what we did. We arbitrarily drew division lines between these groups of teenage boys, and then they ended up just almost killing each other because you created competition and competition for resources. It was like you guys only eat if you win. It was Survivor style, right? Mm-hmm. And they created an imaginary third group that was hostile to both groups. Mm-hmm. And it's the only thing that caused them to work together.
Right.
Is having this imaginary third party, that a third in group, or third out group, excuse me. And it's so funny, like just listening to discourse and political discourse, how often it is the case that in order to unify one's base, in order to try to reach across the aisle, you create an imaginary third group out of scratch. It could be the Middle East for a while, like in the early 20 years ago. I mean, there's obvious dangers there, and there's obvious real
It could be
problem
imaginary
there.
or real.
Yeah, it could be imaginary or real, but it's often a fictive blend of the two, right? It's mostly this story concocted about, immigrants on the border, or, here's someone on the other side of the world who's trying to do us harm, or, here's a political belief system, communism, that we don't believe in.
Right.
It's this, it's this just straight out of this one study, right? It's straight out of this primate thing of just create a third. Independence Day does this. Suddenly there's global cooperation, arrival. Every science fiction where aliens come, humanity unites to against this third out group. So it's the secret to like solving hierarchical kind of cluster problems.
So is there a way that you can have meaningful differences without hierarchy is my question. Like that's a kind of anarchist.
That's the ants, the bees. I mean, if you look at eusocial insects, animals, plant, or no, there can't be a eusocial plant.
What's eusocial mean?
Like true sociality where things are like homogenous.
Uh-huh.
So it's the question of like, do ants have castes, right? Ant colonies have castes. Termite colonies have castes. Bee colonies have castes. But everything's genetically identical, and there's supposed to be no difference between each of the worker ants or worker bees. And so that's kind of your question. Like, yes, there's hierarchy in there, but can you have differentiation, or do you want differentiation amongst those of the same strata in your caste?
Yeah, but or even but so you're saying, but that's just taking it for granted that we do need the hierarchy at some level, even that there are that there are the castes. I'm wondering,
you're thinking casteless entire.
Yeah, are there cooperative groups that are able to work without like an intrinsic structural power that one individual has over another?
Yeah.
Like, can you question that? Again, my disposition is anarchic in that sense. Like, I want to, abolish the police. I do think they cause more harm than good, right? But I also understand the point of view that says, no, you need control, you need structure, you need some sort of sense of like, I guess, of dominance of some kind in certain domains, right? In the domain. And so in filmmaking, right, you wouldn't want a democratic film set.
No.
You wouldn't want like to have to make each decision by consensus.
I've had to write essays by committee. It's a goddamn nightmare. I mean, it's so difficult, right? I mean, any artistic thing where you have like a single kind of author I mean, we do single author stuff. That's what humans kind of do. Most of our artistic outputs are single author stuff, right?
Yeah, well, no, there's been great collaboration.
Oh yeah, I'm talking statistically. Most of them come from a part. Like it requires the kind of unity of vision, the unity of decision making.
So the the deeply right wing person who believes just in the intrinsic necessity and beauty of like entrenched power structures can point to that. Usually, again, we think of art and creativity as a breaking down of boundaries in some way, but then they could argue, I could imagine, and it'd be hard to dismiss it, how all of these structures have given birth to, efficient manifestation of creativity and of individual, expression. Whether it's the Catholic Church and all the great architecture and paintings that came from that came from hierarchy, right? And then even people who have responded to that and even rejected it, they can say, it's actually just a dialogue with something that has formed them, right? So I don't know. It's just I'm really interested as an artist. Like, what should our relationship to the very conception of hierarchy and the very existence of it be? Should we be constantly questioning it and rejecting it? And should it be the content of it and the way it happens to be? Or should it be the actual existence of hierarchy? And I don't know the answer. It's something that I think you would spend a lifetime thinking about.
Have you ever gotten into a fight from eye contact alone? Like,
when I was in high school, you would say, "Oh, you're mad dogging me" or something. It was the word. Like, I remember just being in the mall and like just making eye contact with somebody. Yeah, and he's like, "Why'd you look at me?" And I remember and I'd never gotten in a fight in my life, and this guy just started picking on me for looking at him.
In grad school, there's a kind of local pub, and I went there alone after some long work day, and I was just standing outside, kind of looking around, and I wasn't there with anyone. I was just having a beer and relaxing, and I just saw like an interesting looking group of people that I just kept, like, as I was scanning the room, just standing there drinking my beer. I kind of casually saw a few times, and there's just one guy, and he just kept looking at me, and I just kind of like made eye contact with him a few times, right?
Yeah.
And they looked like an interesting group of people. They looked social. They were friendly. They were happy and everything. So I was just like decided to maybe like walk over and say hi, see what's up. And as I'm halfway there, the guy stands up, like postures, says, "What the fuck are you doing?" Like yells it. It's the whole bar silent. And as soon as he stood up, his friend next to him grabbed his arms, like without even knowing. He just could see something was up, like whatever it was about the way that the man stood. His friend, who was right next to him, like immediately restrained him. And I thought that was an interesting detail. Like pre-verbally, he was already being restrained. And I was like, whoa, I completely misinterpreted the situation, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, whoa, I just like want to chat and exchange witticisms. And
this was at Stanford?
Yeah, this was at Stanford. And then so a guy comes up to me a little bit, or I think it was a woman at the table, comes up to me a little bit. She was like, "Look, I'm sorry about that. We're here celebrating. The guy just got out of prison.
Ooh.
He spent 8 years in prison."
Oh, wow.
And I was like, I had so misinterpreted. I was, friendly research scientist from Palo Alto, where like eye contact is just either like, it's just like an expression of interest. It's not dominance. Yeah. It's not reflection of, hierarchy or submissiveness or attempt or aggression or anything.
Yeah.
And so I realized that like how much society is completely removed from these things that we can revert back to. Yeah. If we get put in a hierarchical, prisons are, you get beaten into submission because of the hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
And just that like eye contact resurrects as a threat display, in the way that it is across every other primate.
Yeah.
And I just had been dissociated from that.
So now I'd love to go back to the beginning of our conversation about repressed sexuality and how that feeds into this, because I took one of my favorite classes at Berkeley was Alan Dundee's folklore class. He was and still is probably the most famous folklorist who ever lived, and he was one of the last remaining Freudians. And he said, when you look at, we had like a whole lecture on sports, and he talked about all of the phallic, all of the kind of symbolism that's in American football, right? And that you're trying to penetrate the opposing team, and you've got this kind of like phallic ball, and then you've got the wide the tight ends and the wide receivers, and you've got this kind of like macho kind of posturing amongst the players and everything, and it's women are excluded, and he said, you know, as I'm talking about this, to try and extrapolate to war and prison and all of these things that are all other sports and all these things that men engage in exclusively, right? And why is there, for example, he said, there's all this kind of homosexual undertones, and then there's this extreme homophobia amongst the people who are engaging in this activity. And his conclusion, and again, this is a very old-fashioned way of seeing it, but I think it's interesting and worth thinking about. He said that the whole enterprise of playing American football is to emasculate the opponent, to penetrate him, to dominate him. And if perchance the opponent enjoys it and wants it, it defeats the entire purpose, and the identity of the player is questioned. So that's why if the opponent, if you find out that in this macho manly world that you with a guy and you pat him in the butt as they do, and they actually enjoy it and actually want to be penetrated in this way, suddenly the whole enterprise collapses according to this view, right? And so I was just thinking, you know, and the Bertollucci in The Conformist, he thinks that there's this very proto-fascist guy who's embracing the hierarchy and everything like this, and then the kind of conclusion is that he's homosexual and unable to face that, and therefore it manifests in this violence, right? And that's what happened in my dream. It was really weird. Like, I've never had this sort of dream before. I've never had I've had one fight in the 8th grade. I've never like had a inclination to violence, right?
I told you there's a bunch of ash in the air from a new fire. The mammalian body perceives that as anxiety. You're going to have anxiety dreams. You're going to have everyone in this entire area is probably having anxiety dreams.
This crazy huge smoke and ash outside and everything. But so I'm wondering so now progressive people are rightly saying, like, let people have more fluid sexuality. Let's break down those boundaries, right? And let's allow people to express their sexuality in the way that they want. And I think that there's an undercurrent belief that will lead to a less violent world, right? I think that these expressions of, like, I mean, we still see people being dragged from a truck for being gay, right? I mean, like, this was, and I remember traveling with a black man from across the country through Texas. We decided to drive, my dear friend Shannon McCullum and I, and we were just like stop in a restaurant, and we were just very good friends. And, you know, like this scene of these two men of different races hanging out together with our kind of more metro California style. Oh my God, I was afraid in some places, just sitting in a restaurant in Texas, like with this guy. And like, so to what degree is the reinforcement of these hierarchies and these differences of, like, rejection of certain, like, unacceptable manifestations of sexuality, how much do these types of hierarchies reinforce a more violent system? To me, it's not a coincidence that you have in these more conservative reactionary parts of the country, you have homophobia mixed with police brutality, mixed with fear of the outsider, and this, so there is the sense that the hierarchy becomes this perverse, repressive, horrible thing that the quicker we break it down, the better. And then on the other hand, you have hierarchy inside, structures in which you're not going to get that violence, whether it's a movie set or a hospital. And it's efficient, and it's a good way to get things done, right? So the question is, how do we pick out the good hierarchies from the bad? I would love to.
Well, and are we even able to distance ourselves from it? There's this weird, I'm gonna maybe call it a statistic. at least a finding that I remember reading about, where if you look at birth rates in countries that are in cities, when they win a large sporting event, there's like a spike 9 months later in births, right? So you win your team wins the Super Bowl, everyone's banging that evening in the town that wins. Not true in the city that loses, right? And so the question is, if we truly want to dismiss a hierarchy, how do we dismiss the basic response to competitive victory that we have? Because I mean, a lot of these fighting, these proto sports, these proto battles between men and women, between so many things, there's a victor. Usually our competitions have victors and they have winners, and there's a response that you get when you win, and that response is hierarchical. To win, to ascend to the alpha rank in a primate troop, you have to beat up everyone along the way. You have to go beat the alpha.
But that's why, I mean, when you go to college, and the bros, the more kind of hierarchically minded, more right-wing people are into fraternities and sports and all this kind of stuff. And the artists and the hippies are like dismissive of that. And you don't see an interest as much in these kind of macho hierarchy based endeavors, right? And the military too. Like, I don't know. I mean, I never occurred to me to want to go to the army, right? Because I have an allergy to the idea of like macho hierarchy.
Yeah, so I could see there being an inclination toward your hierarchical instincts, and then you choose. In the world, you have available to you many things which are very hierarchical and those which are less. And so those who have this inclination to be less hierarchical might gravitate towards the less hierarchical kind of careers, domains, arts. But I still think deeply in there is a response to competition, right? Like there's a physiological hormonal response that you get even while watching a team that you associate with win.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to completely, in the thought experiment, we're abolishing as much hierarchy as we can, it's still the case that there's still going to be affairs where someone feels lesser than because they've been selected against, like, which is establishing hierarchy within family units, within social units, within social groups. There'll still be alphas within a group of people, right? So we're not going to be like, regardless of the institutional structure, if we abolish corporations, we abolish borders, we're still going to have social unit groups like the mice running through the paper towel tube. Stick 5 mice in a cage. They establish a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is physically manifested in their behavior. You're going to have that still. So
but it depends also, like, I mean, there are different manifestations also amongst different species, right? There's we have to get Chris Ryan on here talking about the bonobos versus the chimps, right? But like, it seems they're equally close to humans. And the chimps are much more violent, much more hierarchy based, much more, they have dominance groups and they have competition. And the bonobos that we're as closely related to, there's never been an instance of a bonobo killing another one. And they have orgies, and they have they use sex to instead of to dominate, to kind of resolve conflict and enjoy themselves.
They still have hierarchy. A female baby infant bonobo inherits the rank of her mother.
Mm-hmm.
That might, I'm not 100% sure that's true with bonobos, actually. I take that back.
Study the bonobos.
It's true with one of the primates somewhere. But so I don't know if they have hierarchy, actually. I don't know if they have ranking. If they do, it's probably the case that children will inherit the ranking of their parents. So there's still hierarchy. Yeah. I'm just saying. Supposedly
they're the more hippie. The bonobos are hippie and the chimps are more like Republican.
Right. No, I get the kind of like point of these categories in right and left and the comparison between those that are more or less hierarchical. But I guess my argument is that even those that are fully on the extreme of as little hierarchy as possible, mm-hmm. you're still going to find traces of hormonal response to competition, which establishes some kind of hierarchy, and probably social ranking, which is still hierarchical. You're still going to get displacement aggression. You're still going to get the nurse who picks on the Muni driver and me who picks on the nurse, and or like defends the Muni driver effectively. Yeah. You're still going to have things like that. So it's only the case that the thought experiment of let's remove as much hierarchy and border as we can only go so far. There's a limit to it. I would love to see what it would look like to become eusocial, become like termites or like humanity. I guess that's communism. Is that communism?
Yeah, or a kind of egalitarian tribalism, which I think people like Chris Ryan advocate for. That if you have a closeness, and Terence McKenna was very into this, when you had a closeness to nature, his thought, and I like this a lot, was that like psychedelics were great for kind of dismantling boundaries and hierarchies. And that the reason that civilizations or cultures are so threatened by that is because they depend on those boundaries existing. That's why in the 60s, when all these people started taking psychedelics and questioning the war and questioning their jobs and all this stuff, the establishment freaked out. And the idea is that when you have cultures that are less boundary defined and less hierarchy bound, they're going to feel less threatened by these experiences and be able to embrace them. And that's why Aboriginal cultures and tribal cultures in South America are able to ingest these substances and embrace the dissolution of these boundaries, because their very existence isn't dependent on them.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that the question then is your view of nature, and I think it depends where you look, right? Is your view of nature as one that's fundamentally boundary and hierarchy defined?
Right.
And the closer we get to it, the more we're going to find that. And do you think human beings are inherently violent and dominating and kind of identified with these hierarchies? Or is your view of human nature, and it goes even back to Confucius versus Lao Tzu, right? Like the Taoist view that if you let nature take its course, you will have a less violent, less boundary defined existence. And or is the role of civilization and of religion and of power to kind of control these instincts that are at bottom are violent and base, right?
Yeah.
And it's a really deeply different view of what human nature is and what nature is, right? And I think it's a conversation we can have for probably years to come.
Yeah, or maybe another episode.
Yeah, we're an hour and one in, so
okay.
Let's continue tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Good talk.